there aren't a lot of outlets that are talking about the very compelling information that Pablo has put forth in his latest episode on the Clippers scandal. But we're going to cover this with some depth. And before we get to the details and the bullet points, we're going to start off with a really good quote from Pablo. And this is from his appearance on the Dan Le Batard Show.
No one has the ability to buy the rest of the NBA combined. This guy does. No one was the CEO of the foremost monopoly in America, Microsoft, when the American government's antitrust department was coming after them for monopolistic behavior and anti-competitive practices. That was Steve Ballmer. Steve Ballmer didn't give a about the rules around competition when it came to the actual federal laws. You think he cares about the NBA salary cap when he
All right, so that's a really good start, a really good backdrop to a lot of information that we need to go through from Pablo's latest podcast. And we're going to get to this. I've got an outline. We're going to go through this outline. And let's just start with a few early thoughts. First of all, this is only possible because Pablo Torre decided to invest hundreds, if not thousands of hours into investigating this. If Pablo Torre does not exist, this story never sees the light of day. So that's what I have here. And this is also only possible because Pablo was brave enough to investigate this and report on this. This doesn't happen without Pablo. This is yet another story that's swept away, or not. We never even know about it. It's not even swept away. We never hear about this. So I think that's something that's just passed by. But I think the courage to report on this is another aspect we don't see being talked about, because how many other media outlets do you see that are scurrying away from this story? I mean, right now, present day, February 14th, Valentine's Day, 2026, All-Star Weekend, Pablo's done all of the hard work. We still don't even see people reporting on the evidence that Pablo is putting forth. And this really is like a real-life NBA true crime Netflix series. So I've got an image here representing that. But it really is beyond just the story itself and the information. It is brilliant and fascinating in a way, and I think that's also a part of what Pablo's doing is he's drip feeding this. But it's just it's been a really compelling series from Pablo, and I can actually see this somehow making its way onto Netflix, and there are more angles that come into play, including the lack of media coverage, which that will be a separate episode. That's a bullet point coming up. So another thought, Wachtell Lipton, the law firm that the NBA hired to investigate this, will look horrible if the Clippers aren't found to have circumvented the salary cap. And from what I understand, the NBA doesn't have to disclose the findings of Wachtell Lipton, right? The NBA they've commissioned Wachtell Lipton to conduct this investigation. But if the NBA comes back and says, well, there wasn't enough to connect the Clippers here, that's also going to make Wachtell Lipton look bad. All right. So on this latest episode, Pablo talks on the Dan Le Batard Show from the clip I just played of that episode. Pablo talks about how there's not a lot of coverage, and they start to contemplate why that's the case. And they talk about, well, maybe this is too difficult, or it's too boring, too complex. I don't see it as so much too complex as I do. I mean, there are parts of this where you start to go and there are layers to the details and just connecting the dots. But I think for me, having gone through this episode multiple times, I think there's just so much information that it becomes, I mean, there are several bullet points that Pablo goes through. And for each of these bullet points, you could have like a 10, 15, maybe 20-minute episode just breaking down the implications and what the evidence is, because there are waves of information, and they're not all in a line. You know, some of these are coming from different angles, so there's more nuance to them. So I think that's part of the difficulty with this. But the big takeaway here is that there's so much damning evidence, and it would be very hard to explain away what Pablo has presented in this latest episode, and of course all of the episodes before that. And then one question I had just thinking through this is, we see the Clippers just furious, just scurrying, trying to make sure that they can get Kawhi, and they're doing everything they can. And the question I have is, would Kawhi have signed with them anyway? Because he's from Moreno Valley, which is an hour and 5 minutes from Los Angeles. He was never going to sign with the Raptors. And then if it was the Lakers, then he would have been, even though he would have been the best player, he would have been LeBron's sidekick. And it's actually foreshadowing into a later bullet point. But would he have signed with him anyway, right? Like if there was no salary cap circumvention and everybody just said, hey, like we can give you this contract and nothing more according to the NBA's rules, would he have signed with him anyway? And so I think that's a question I was pondering. I'm just thinking about this. There's so many different angles to this, and one of them is maybe the Clippers didn't have to do anything. It was a natural choice. The Clippers would be his team. He wouldn't be on LeBron's team. He wouldn't be living in Canada. There wouldn't be the cold. He'd be playing an hour and 5 minutes away from where he grew up. He also went to, what is the college? Was it San Diego State? So, I mean, there were a lot of reasons to sign with the Clippers. So continuing on, let's go. I've played the Steve Ballmer quote. Let's actually go back to the Dan Le Batard Show, and let's look at a question that was asked during Pablo's appearance. So it will be I think it's at 1450.
Pablo, will anyone have the guts to ask the commissioner about this at All-Star Weekend?
So he was just asked, Pablo, will anybody have the guts to ask Adam Silver about this at All-Star Weekend, which is taking place right now?
I don't think so. I don't. I mean, I've been canvassing media members. Sadly, Dan, like, again, thank you, Dan, for paying for the reporting, for having me on the show. I have back channeled to lots of other people with shows, and they don't want to touch it because they don't get it, because they think nothing's going to happen, because they're like, wake me up when the punishment comes. And I'm like, the whole point here is to use journalism in public to hold accountability up as a goal for everybody to still strive for. Waiting for the NBA to punish this, you're waiting for the system that enabled it to punish itself. Why would anybody expect them to do anything they didn't have to do? And so all you can do, to answer your question, is ask questions, but I don't think people really are in the mood for doing that. That's
all right. So that's another good excerpt, also telling, here Pablo saying that he back channeled and nobody wants to cover this. And, I think everyone's just looking for safety. And I think, like he said, they're waiting for the punishment, but this is the story. It's being presented to you. And as incredible as it sounds, the reality is there's very compelling evidence that someone's already done all of the work for it. Pablo's already done all of the work, and it's still, these media outlets still won't report on it. And that's a separate episode. I'm going to get into this. We're going to look at the actual coverage, and we're going to search YouTube. We're going to look on Google. We're going to look on Google News, and we're going to see who is actually covering this, and covering this in more than just, hey, this has happened, or, Pablo's made another release. I haven't seen a lot of talk about this. Pablo released this latest episode just before the All-Star game. Very much relevant, right? You have Kawhi Leonard, you have Steve Ballmer, you have Adam Silver, all in one place. It's already been months since the initial series of episodes was released, and nobody, well, I shouldn't say nobody, but very few outlets have picked this up. And aside from maybe independent YouTube channels like myself, you just don't see this being talked about. So I wanted to add that, and let's now go back to the outline. Let's see. We have immense pressure on the NBA because here you have the richest. By far the richest sports owner. He's the 10th or 13th or whatever it is, richest man in the world, versus basically a podcaster's investigation. That's what's going on here. Because any punishment that comes from the NBA is really a result of what Pablo has done, and not of the NBA doing anything besides really evaluating whether or not it's enough. And so the NBA no longer gets credit for this, because what we saw here was the delay game, because there was so much information from Pablo, very compelling information, which should have been enough on its own. But we have this investigation, and what happens, maybe it didn't happen here, but what happens all too often is we see a story that's released, information comes out, and then what can happen is the entity will go ahead and delay any type of finding. So here with the NBA, it would be Commissioner Adam Silver, and he could make a decision, but they elect to wait. Now, it's understandable if there's an investigation, but this investigation has spanned now months, and it doesn't need to take this long, but it's been drawn out until now. And around the All-Star game was when there was expected to be a decision. It still hasn't come yet. But now it's taken so long. What's happened is, even if the NBA does come back and punish the Clippers, they get like no credit for this, because Pablo's already laid out all of the evidence for you. You didn't even need to hire Walktel Lipton. Here it is. All you have to do is follow up with Steve Ballmer and the Clippers and ask, is this true? Right? There's your investigation. But it took too long. And so now this evidence is very damning. So the question now becomes, like, how would this not be salary cap circumvention and or tampering, if you want to add that to this? Because as we will see with one of these bullet points from the episode, the Clippers are connected to Kawhi indirectly as early as, I think it was 2017. So we're going to get more into that in a moment. But the bullet point here one of the thoughts that I have is that now, like, the NBA doesn't get credit for stepping up the way they would have if earlier on, before all of this information is public, they would have just said, you know what, there's enough here to where it looks like salary cap circumvention, to where we're going to find that you circumvented the salary cap. And as we'll see, in fact, I'm about to talk about this, it would have worked out better for the NBA and the Clippers if they would have just they would have just admitted that this happened. It would have been so much better for them. So I talked about the separate media coverage. We're going to talk about who's covering it, who's not, why the lack of coverage, which the Dan Le Batard Show, the episode I just played, they get into that. I will be playing a few clips from that. But as I just said, the Clippers could have admitted this early on, but it's been made so much worse because we have the delay game. And now what we're seeing is just more evidence that's been piled on by Pablo. And in fact, I'm going to play a clip from when was this? When did I publish this episode? This is from 4 months ago on September 14th. So on September 14th, I have a video. What if I'm the Clippers? Where do I go from here? So let's play the clip.
First,
we need to admit that we circumvented the salary cap, and we need to tell the NBA right away, ideally on Monday morning, but as soon as possible. And as far as our press release, once we've got squared with the NBA, there is no hedge. Yes, we circumvented the NBA salary cap as shown by our OKC trade. We went all in, and then we kept going way too far to try to bring a championship to Clippers fans. And then I have here, we, depending on how Steve Ballmer wants to play it, we went too far in our zest to win a championship. We need to take control of the situation, and that is what this does. Once we have the admission, we take control of the situation, and we end the Pablo drip feed. Otherwise, we're going to be continually reacting to Pablo's news releases. Right now, Pablo Mania is running wild all over the NBA. We need to end this as soon as possible. We also need to end Wachtell and Lipton's law firm investigation. So the NBA hired Wachtell and Lipton. We need to end this investigation. There's no need for them to find anything else. They're already going to find out that we circumvented the salary cap. It's going to cost the NBA much more money if we let this continue. So let's end this right now. Also, we need to take... All right, so I'm going to stop it there. I continue on. But this, if the Clippers would have done this, if the Clippers would have just ended it, hey, we circumvented the salary cap, this could have prevented potentially so much more information. Maybe Pablo continues to pile on, but the story's over. We already admitted this. Let's go ahead and end this. No more investigation. It becomes so much easier. The punishment can be lighter, but now there's not really a way back because we already have Steve Ballmer on ESPN stating unequivocally we didn't do certain things, right? We didn't do XYZ. We already have multiple press releases from the Clippers denying what happened. And now Pablo has so much evidence, and you had to know that he wasn't, if there was more information to be found based on his investigation so far, based on how thorough he was, it probably wasn't going to stop at the damning evidence that he'd found already, right? We didn't know how far he had gone, but this would be something from the Clippers' point of view. If you know there are other ongoings that have taken place outside of this aspiration reporting, then that would be something to consider when deciding whether or not just to go ahead. Hey, let's go ahead and just admit this to the NBA, just say we did it, and we can put this to rest. And then if Pablo wants to continue on with the story, we can say, hey, asked and answered, we admitted this happened, and then put it into it the best we can. But otherwise, it just leaves it open for there to be more and more investigation, which, as we're about to go through with this information, this does not work in the Clippers' favor. All right, so let's go back to the outline, and we are now going to get to this episode. So let's go ahead. We've got an hour and almost 21-minute episode from Pablo. It's titled Exclusive Ballmer and Kawhi's Hidden Trail of Clipper Deals Unearthed. As I said, this is just waves of information, so I'm going to take you through most of the waves. We're not going to cover all of the details. There are too many details to cover. There are too many dots to connect. I'm just going to tell you generally what are the bullet points from this episode, starting with, we have this one clip, and let's actually play the clip because this is a good starting point. So we're going to go to 4:23 on the timeline.
We exasperated Michael Winger, who was the Clippers general manager and collective bargaining rules expert from 2017 to 2023, said aloud in the office upon discovering yet another hidden arrangement with Kawhi and his uncle Dennis, this quote, which is the first piece of paper in your folder.
Ooh, this one is a big font. This should have been read by you. So.
Without glasses.
Yeah,
that is big.
All right, quote, how many f***ing side deals have we made with Kawhi?
All right, so that starts the whole episode, and you see there's just a continual effort to first bring Kawhi onto the Clippers, and then also to retain him. And this is, of course, all alleged, as Dan Le Batard states in his in this episode, this other clip with Pablo, where he's really the Dan Le Batard clip is or the episode is really the supplement to this initial episode. But with this initial episode, you get all the details. With the Dan Le Batard appearance, you get more of the quick takeaways. But this is a start, right? This is a key bullet point because here you have this figure inside of the Clippers front office, and he's asking this question allegedly. So that's the first bullet point I have. And then let's see what here. And that's Michael Winger, and I think he's now with the Wizards. And then so we also get Lawrence Frank's non-answer, which was ridiculous. I covered this at the time. It was as if the Clippers decided not to care about media day and answering these questions, and you have Lawrence Frank roll out and give this just a really bad answer. So let's see if we have this here.
No comment or next question, rather than to do.
Actually, I want to play so Pablo plays the clip.
So by the powers of deduction.
Actually, it still didn't go back far enough. All right, here we go.
Clippers Media Day, and what Ramona Shelburne from ESPN, who later had the microphone taken from her by Clippers PR, dared to ask was this.
Has Dennis Robertson, Kawhi's uncle, ever asked for any extra benefits that wouldn't be allowable under the NBA salary cap directly to you? There's been a lot coming out about his asks.
Yeah, look, Dennis knows the rules, Kawhi knows the rules, Mitch Franco knows the rules, and we know the rules.
Is that a yes or a no?
Yes, we all know the rules.
Okay, so and they get to this in the episode. That's as David Sampson says, that's absolutely an absurd answer. But it's worth repeating because it was so there was no need to do that. Like having that kind of ridiculous answer to knowing the rules. It's just a clip that's going to end up played back over and over again. But yeah, it's another start to here. It really just sets up the episode. But I wanted to play it again. I've covered it before, but I was so surprised that the Clippers elected to go with the route of like, hey, here's Lawrence Frank. He's rolled out of bed, and now he's going to be answering questions at media day right after we have all of this information about a potential scandal for our franchise, and this is the answer he's going to give. All right, so bullet point number 3. We have a lawsuit. So here we have 11 aspiration investors filed a civil lawsuit, and it was later amended to name Steve Ballmer as a defendant, and that's alongside the aspiration founder Joe Sandberg, who has already pleaded guilty to wire fraud. And so the investors are alleging that Steve Ballmer promoted aspiration as legitimate while fraud was occurring, and that the relationship also benefited Steve Ballmer by helping to get extra money to Kawhi outside of the NBA salary cap rules. Important note: this is only a lawsuit; it's not definitive proof, but this is alleged by the plaintiffs. And so here we have, and this is a screenshot, by the way, taken from Pablo's. Pablo actually has this in his episode. So this is a screenshot, and we have a paragraph 6 from the complaint. I think this is the complaint. Sandberg and Ballmer worked together to make Katona, and then what Katona was, let's see here. I think aspiration was renamed to Katona. So I'm making sure of that. I didn't write that down. But anyway, either way, I think this is actually aspiration. But Sandberg and Ballmer worked together to make Katona appear to be more successful, to be a successful company backed by Ballmer, who is one of the wealthiest people in the world, worth over 150 billion. With Ballmer's knowledge, support, and assistance, Sandberg and Ballmer promoted Katona to lend legitimacy to Katona's operations, and Ballmer publicly endorsed Katona. This enticed investors like plaintiffs to entrust and keep their capital in Katona and helped hide the rampant fraud occurring at the company. It also served Ballmer's interest in getting extra money to Leonard so he could circumvent the salary cap, beat out the competition, and re-sign the team's superstar player. So you see this, it's this what's being alleged here, right? That there's salary cap circumvention. We just see this coming up over and over again from different angles. And then so we have Pablo made note of Steve Ballmer's legal team's response, and they filed a motion to dismiss, and they kept describing the allegations as coming from a podcast, so sensational claims coming from a podcast, and they used the word podcast over and over again. But in the episode, Pablo notes the Ballmer team offered no factual corrections to more than 500 minutes of prior coverage. So this is one thing that's been funny, and I think it's actually strengthening anybody referring to someone as a podcast. But the downplaying of any information coming from Pablo being that it's a sports podcast. I think it was Ramona Shelbourne who called him podcaster Pablo Torre, which I talked about in a previous episode. It's not an insult. I know it's like they want to make it seem like it's illegitimate because it's coming from a podcast. Podcast is it's just a dissemination of information, right? And it's not there's no insult here, and I don't think maybe they think it still carries that it's just like some podcast, but it's like, why can't a podcast have legitimate information? That doesn't really make sense to me, but it does appear to be a tactic that was used to refer to this as a podcast, so as to downplay the importance or the accuracy of the information. So then we have bullet point 5, and this is where Pablo is really talking about, hey, they said that there was so much due diligence done on this aspiration deal, but there actually was not. And so let's just read through the summary I have here. Ballmer's lawyers claim he conducted thorough due diligence before investing $50 million in aspiration, but the Wall Street Journal reported that Ballmer and Sandberg hardly knew each other. Also, we have here internal emails show that the deal went from first legal contact to signed in about 11 days, and this is including Labor Day weekend. So making the point that, hey, deals of this magnitude and of this length, the contract was over 200 pages long. They just don't get done this fast. Let's see. And yeah, David Sampson adds context here, but there was also source number 1. So Pablo goes back to source number 1. We have the modulated voice, and we have here, this timeline is highly unusual for a deal this size. According to source number 1, the aspiration was broke, and that's why this needed to happen really, really fast. And then also, I'm not going to play the clips, but on 2120 in the episode, we have unheard of for an investment deal to be completed at this pace before. So there is this aspect or this bullet point. Then we have number 6. We also have the incentives for Ballmer to rush to the deal. So the episode argues that there were multiple incentives beyond Kawhi Leonard, beyond any potential alleged salary cap circumvention. And there was the upside that if aspiration went public via a SPAC, which is a merger where an already public company, in this case it would be Interprivate, takes a company underneath to create another company. Aspiration Public is what this new entity would be. Then Aspiration would have been worth $2.2 billion. And I think source number 1 said this was at least. And this is just me trying to extract information. So if anything is off here, this is just me trying to summarize what I'm hearing. But basically, that if Aspiration went public via a SPAC, they would be worth a lot more. We also have the $300 million sponsorship deal between the Clippers and Aspiration. And then we just have this add-in that despite all of the red flags that were presented, Steve Ballmer invested another $10 million in 2023, and that's after the initial 2021 investment. And at this time when he's investing, other investors are staying away from Aspiration. So again, start to think about all of this combined. None of this has to be true, right? None of these bullet points have to necessarily be true. But when we're looking at this cumulatively, how is this not salary cap circumvention? And there's more to go through, right? I'm only halfway through these bullet points, but as I'm going through it, just think none of this has to be true, but how do you answer to the documents and the information and the sources Pablo has? How do you respond to that in a way that unravels this entire the entire salary cap circumvention that is that's Pablo saying exists? All right, so we have number 7, shell or impossible business partners. So here we have federal witnesses say many of Aspiration's listed corporate partners were 50-50. They were either shell companies or they were businesses that couldn't afford the carbon offset deals that they were supposedly going to buy. So this getting at it was problems in just looking through. If you're doing due diligence, there are problems with Aspiration on just who their actual I think here their business partners or their customers were. So this getting at basic checks, if there was due diligence, a basic checks like a public records check or reference calls could have brought this up into the light and then raised questions, and then so there you could look further into the company. So then we have Kawhi's recruiting. So then the episode shifts into a different side where we have Kawhi's trainer, whose name is Randy Shelton, and we find out this information, I think in part or because of another lawsuit that was filed by Randy Shelton. So after, I think it was the 2016 playoffs, Kawhi Leonard gets hurt because he steps on Zaza Pachulia's foot, and we have Kawhi and the Spurs friction. This has been, I think there was friction before he gets hurt in the playoffs, but then there was also just ongoing friction with the Spurs and Kawhi because I think if it's the medical, the diagnosis on the medical side, or just the Spurs saying that he was good to play and Kawhi stating he wasn't, whatever it was, right? There was known friction or presumed friction between Kawhi and not the Clippers, Kawhi and the Spurs, and then there's a connection now between the Clippers and Kawhi Leonard's personal trainer, Randy Shelton. And so in this lawsuit that is filed by Shelton, beginning in 2017, while Kawhi was under contract with the Spurs, Clippers hire a new assistant GM, Mark Hughes, and he repeatedly contacts Shelton to gather private medical information, gauge Kawhi's interest, and promise Shelton a Clippers job. So all of this is in a lawsuit, which doesn't mean it's true. It's just information that we're getting from this lawsuit that is brought by Randy Shelton. And then Shelton also makes claims that Lawrence Frank personally met with him in 2019 and made similar assurances. So one note here is that Mark Hughes is a recent hire, a new assistant GM, and he's there. And then we have also this Lawrence Frank part. And then here's another screenshot from Pablo's episode. And then the highlight is, in 2017, assistant general manager Mark Hughes began pursuing Leonard through Shelton. Hughes repeatedly emphasized the need for discretion as Hughes sought private health information about Leonard, and Hughes discussed the Clippers' desire to obtain Leonard and the likelihood of attracting Leonard to join the Clippers. Hughes set up numerous meetings with Shelton beginning in 2017, while Leonard was still under contract, to attempt to find out Leonard's contractual requirements and medical situation. And from there, I read Leonard's contractual requirements as what is Kawhi going to need to sign with the Clippers, but that's me reading into this. And then we have here tampering. David Sampson provides us a nice definition. When a player is under contract with Team X, no other representative can talk to him about playing for Team Y. All right, so that's where I talked about tampering coming into play. This would be tampering. And then we have another snippet from the Shelton lawsuit. As a part of these discussions, Hughes discussed bringing Shelton into the Clippers organization as a strength and conditioning coach, given the personal relationship and trust that Leonard had with Shelton. Let's see. And then we have Randy Shelton actually hired by the Clippers in 2019. And then we've got another, courtesy of Pablo, we have another screenshot of the actual employment agreement. We'll get to that in a moment. So we have this wrongful termination lawsuit. And then, so we've got Mark Hughes. Then we have the allegedly, he's assigned to recruit Kawhi through Shelton. And then in October 5th, 2017, we have Randy Shelton filing an LLC named KL2 Performance LLC. And the agent for service of process was Randy Shelton. So if you'll remember from Pablo's earlier episodes, he talked about KL2 Aspire LLC. We'll see more of these KL2 LLCs in a moment, but we have Randy Shelton filing for this LLC. And so we have KL2 Aspire, as I just mentioned, was created in November 22, 2021, and was allegedly how Aspiration was sending money through a third party. So we have salary cap circumvention. That's what's being alleged here. And we also have Kawhi Leonard going on to file 16 of these LLCs. So here the idea is that allegedly the Clippers were sending money to Kawhi through any of these various LLCs. Okay, so continue on. Let's go ahead and read another snippet from a complaint, or I don't know, is this a complaint? Either way, this is from one of the documents in a lawsuit. So we have Frank himself met personally with Shelton in San Diego in or around February 19th to discuss Leonard's willingness to join the Clippers and assuring Leonard through Shelton that the Clippers would provide all of the necessary provisions for his success at the highest level in free agency and all of the vital members who could have an impact on who could have an impact on, I think, on is missing, Leonard's decision. Frank personally assured Shelton that he would have a position within the strength, condition, and performance department for the Clippers if Leonard decided to join the Clippers in free agency. Still, during Leonard and the Raptors championship run, Shelton again was asked to meet with the Clippers regarding Leonard's willingness to sign with the Clippers. In this meeting, Shelton met with John Mayer, Director of Medical and Performance for the Clippers, and Lee Jenkins, Director of Research and Identity. So there we have that last paragraph. Still, during Leonard and the Raptors championship run, Shelton was again asked to meet with the Clippers regarding Leonard's willingness to sign with the Clippers. All right, so let's now move on. We've got another connection, another indirect Kawhi connection, and this is Johnny Wilkes. So Johnny Wilkes was a teammate of Uncle Dennis in high school, and Uncle Dennis is Kawhi Leonard's uncle, and Johnny Wilkes also sued the Clippers. One important note with these lawsuits, just because it's in a lawsuit, it doesn't mean it's true. It's just what these different people that are alleging who are suing the Clippers. So we have this connection we have Johnny Wilkes suing the Clippers, but he is connected through text message and voicemail to Jerry West, who the Clippers hired. So the Johnny Wilkes lawsuit produced text messages and a voicemail from Jerry West, who the Clippers have hired, showing the Clippers closely tracking Kawhi Leonard's free agency decision in July 2019. Johnny Wilkes was a friend of Uncle Dennis, who claimed he was promised $2.5 million for helping deliver Kawhi. The case was dismissed for a lack of a written contract, but the communications support how aggressive and how anxious the Clippers were. And Pablo actually plays a clip of Johnny Wilkes talking about that he was, I think this is what the clip said, that Johnny Wilkes said he was promised $2.5 million and that he should have asked for 10 because that's how, I think something along the lines of it was worth more to the Clippers, something to that effect. But the lawsuit was dismissed. But here we have Johnny Wilkes stating this, and then we have a snippet of Lawrence Frank, another instance of Lawrence Frank stating that we follow the rules, and so I think they put up a quote in the podcast, and then at 58 minutes, let's go ahead and play this. Oh no, yeah, this is actually worth playing. So at 58 minutes, we have one of the LLCs. The LLC started by Randy Shelton. This is the first KL2 LLC. We have this LLC go dormant, and we're going to go ahead and play the clip because I think this is just worth noting here.
Long after that, November 2019. There was a more subtle change in the business life of Randy Shelton, the trainer, and his Navi, Kawhi Leonard. Because according to, again, the California Secretary of State's database, the LLC Shelton had started in 2017, the same year he was being recruited by the Clippers and their assistant GM, KL2 Performance LLC, received a notice, the first in a series of delinquency notices. And by the following year, September 2020, with Kawhi and his trainer both employed on the books by the Clippers, KL2 Performance LLC was officially suspended from operating as a business in California, indicating that the person behind it, for some reason, no longer needed it anymore. The patient zero of LLCs had functionally expired.
Hasta la vista, baby.
All right, so the LLC is no longer needed and it expires. Again, why did you start this LLC and why did you let it expire? And as we will see, the LLC gets revived. So we have that LLC going dormant. We do have the Randy Shelton employment. Here is a screenshot of the employment agreement from Pablo's podcast. And so this just states that the Clippers are making Randy Shelton the assistant performance coach of the Clippers. And then we get to another part. And this is, let's see, so let's go to a minute 30 because what happened was Randy Shelton's employment agreement appears to have been negotiated by Dennis Robertson. And I have here an hour and 30 seconds in. So we're going to go ahead and play this other clip because I think this one it's another good clip. I mean, there's so much good information here, but let's go ahead and start with an hour and 25 seconds.
Via electronic mail to the email address set forth below and delivered personally or sent overnight courier to the addresses set forth below. If to team, Lawrence Frank, LA Clippers, with a copy to Nicole Duckett, LA Clippers.
Nicole Duckett was the Clippers' chief legal counsel representing Lawrence Frank. That makes sense. But Randy Shelton's equivalent, who is also receiving every legal notice, is who?
If to employee Randy Shelton, with a copy to Dennis Robertson.
So this speaks to something else that Randy Shelton has claimed in this lawsuit, which is that his employment contract was personally negotiated between Lawrence Frank, the president of the team, and Dennis Robertson, an unlicensed NBA agent who was so unlicensed that Adam Silver, you may recall, changed the league rules in response to an investigation of his dealings in 2019 to prevent people like him from negotiating deals like this ever again. I remind you, of course, that this contract is from 2021. But nonetheless, Could you please keep reading from Randy Shelton's lawsuit?
Moreover, plaintiff alleges that Mr. Robertson threatened him with exclusion from the Clippers unless he agreed to pay 10% of his compensation, a demand that raises serious questions of duress, coercion, and procedural unconscionability.
So why was Uncle Dennis taking 10% of Randy Shelton's contract? This alone is, it just raises so many more questions. I mean, why if the Clippers really wanted to just hire Randy Shelton, then why is Dennis Robertson taking 10% of his contract? And maybe the Clippers don't know that, but they talk about this.
This all means, to translate it, that allegedly Uncle Dennis threatened to fire Kawhi's personal trainer from his job with the Clippers if the trainer didn't pay Uncle Dennis the agent fee.
The kickback, yep.
10% of the salary in his employment contract. This would be weird, if only because Uncle Dennis did not work for the Clippers and supposedly does not dictate what they do with these shady side deals because they all know the rules.
Uncle Dennis could claim that he is acting as Randy Shelton's agent. Randy Shelton's agent, whoever that is, does not need to be certified by the NBPA, so it could be literally anyone.
Well, what I am told reliably by sources close to this situation is the Clippers were not only totally aware of this arrangement, allegedly, they agreed to this practice as a way of getting more money to Uncle Dennis.
There it is. There it is. That's what I was waiting for. So yeah, allegedly this was about a way for Uncle Dennis to get more money. And at this point, one of the things that stands out is how much money do you need to extract? I mean, just Kawhi and his uncle, throughout this process, whether it's we see the actual money, like it's just publicly known that they're getting the money, or we just hear these different stories, like why do you have to vacuum up all of the money? Wouldn't you think that at some point it's like, hey, we're taking on unnecessary risk by trying to get as much money as possible? We can ruin this thing with our own greed, but it does not stop. I mean, this guy, and they show later that this guy was making about 200, I think it was 220 to start with, and it went up 5,000 every year. So 220, 225, and then 230, something along those lines. And to take 10% of that, you're getting about $22,000. I mean, it doesn't stop. And I don't know, it's like, how much does Uncle Dennis need to get paid? How much does Kawhi need to get paid? But that was, I thought, I mean, there's a direct connection there between Uncle Dennis and Randy Shelton, if that's true. But that was another, I thought, a very interesting bullet point. So let's actually go back to the bullet points. We've just covered Uncle Dennis and Randy Shelton. And then we get to the KL2 LLCs. So we start to see, we saw the initial KL2 Performance LLC. This went dormant once Shelton was employed by the Clippers, but then it was revived in 2023 with Uncle Dennis listed as the manager. So why was it revived? Why does Kawhi Leonard have all of these LLCs? And then we have several new KL2 LLCs were created days before Kawhi signed his 2024 extension. And then so when we look at the timing of this, it's not that an LLC has to mean that anything was wrong, but what are all of these LLCs being used for? And then, so we have this, I think I got it out of order here. We have the Shelton's lawsuit demanded 10% of, that Uncle Dennis demanded 10% of Shelton's Clipper salary. Let's see. So we've covered that. And then on 12 is what I wanted to get at. So Kawhi takes less than the max extension, which is just, I mean, curious, like beyond curious, because given what we know about Kawhi, given that we know he's looking for all of the money, why did he take less than a max extension? He took $9 million below the max extension in January of 2024. And then when we go up and we look at these new LLCs, why were these new LLCs being created? Was this a funnel to Kawhi to get the money he otherwise would have been paid and potentially much, much more? We don't know. We don't know that for 100% certain, but that's why we have questions being raised about these new LLCs. So I have here a timestamp, and we're going to go ahead and play at 1 hour, 11 minutes in of this podcast.
Investigators have been looking into this part, but for now, let's just keep scrolling through the California Secretary of State database, because you'll notice that in the days before the Clippers announced Kawhi's submax extension on January 10th, 2024, a few new LLCs were born.
KL2 Content LLC, that was December 28, 2023. KL2 RIFC LLC, January 2nd, 2024. And KL2 RIFC Real Estate, January 2nd, 2024.
January 10th, I will remind you all, 2024 was when that extension was signed. And unlike KL2 Aspire LLC and KL2 Performance LLC, patient zero, KL2 Content LLC, KL2 RFC LLC, and KL2 RFC Real Estate LLC all remain active. Do this.
All right, and so we'll end the clip there. But the question: why was this LLC created? We can look at the I'm sure Wachtell and Lipton can look into the documentation. Where was the source of income? But that is the question that arises there. All right, so then we're towards the end here. We have Lawrence Frank's extension. Pablo states that some NBA executives privately describe this as hush money. So we're going to extend Lawrence Frank. That's the implication there. And then Pablo has this one final question, which Pablo is very interested in this. There was a federal investigation into aspiration that began with an internal whistleblower, sources say. So the key question is whether or not that whistleblower explicitly told federal authorities that Steve Ballmer allegedly circumvented the NBA salary cap. So this is where everything leads off with this final question. But there's so much here. There's so many different angles to this that, I mean, just the media one being an obvious one, but there are so many questions that rise from this. And so we'll be looking for, we'll be answering, not we'll be answering, but we'll be looking into this in the coming episodes.